everyone, Amy here, presenter and producer of the Eerie Excursion podcast, the podcast that takes the road less travelled, the left turn into the shadows to hear haunted and creepy tales from around the UK, as told by local tour guides and experts. Now, after the eeriness of last week with ghost children and poltergeists in Edinburgh, this week we take a nice drive in the countryside to hear about folk tales in Derbyshire. Eagle-eared among you would have recognised the guide this week. It was Simon, who was one of the guides in Nottingham as well. Now, he's actually from Derbyshire, and as you can see from the map, you can actually see just how close Nottingham and Derby, or Derbyshire is. They basically border. Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire border each other. It's so close, in fact, Nottingham is so close that one of its most famous legends, Robin Hood, actually has a lot of stories in Derbyshire. And Simon says he actually found there were more stories of Robin Hood in Derbyshire than in Nottinghamshire. And in fact, even his right-hand man, Little John, is from Derbyshire.
Story has it that Little John, obviously Robin Hood's right-hand man, after Robin died, he wandered the lands for quite some time and eventually decided that he would go back to Hathersage from whence he came. And in his wanderings, so the legends sort of vary. Some say that he had a vision, some say it was in a dream, some say he was told, but he was told, if you go back to Hathersage, if you enter the churchyard there, you'll be dead in 3 days. So Little John thought, well, that's easy enough. I just won't go into the churchyard. Anyway, as he came off the moors around Hathersage, which themselves are rich with folklore, there's also a Robin Hood's cave up there as well, which is amazing. As I say, more Robin Hoods in Derbyshire than Nottinghamshire. And as he came down to the village of his birth, a great fog came down. But he knew his way and he carried on. And as the fog cleared, lo and behold, he found himself in the churchyard. And he knew that his time was short. So he finished off his last few days in the village of his birth and he was buried in Hathersage churchyard.
Now, I really love legends that are about heroes who get told their fate and then they do everything they can to try and outwit fate, but then it wins and catches up with them. Fate always wins, I think, is the moral of that, the stories there. But I just think it's really cool. And you can actually see Little John's grave. In fact, actually, I think it's in one of the videos. If you look at when I zoomed in on the map, you see there's a mark in Hathersage where there is the grave of Little John, which you can visit. So some more legends of the slightly eerier kind in Derbyshire. Now, there's 2 stories about witches in this episode. One is about a witch who becomes a werewolf, and there's a king and a prince. It's a really cool story. Not going to tell that one, though, because my favourite one was the one at the very end of the episode about 2 sisters and a Scotsman. So I'll let Simon tell you that story.
There was a couple of sisters who were milliners, that's hat makers, who lived in Bakewell, and to supplement their income, they ran their home as a lodging house. Now, one day, a Scotsman, a peddler who was travelling from Scotland down to London, he stopped there. He got a room with the sisters, and all seemed well. However, a few days later, the Scotsman was arrested for vagrancy in London. When he was thrown in front of the magistrate, he came up with this absolutely outlandish story. And what it was, he said that he'd been stopping at the cottage and he was upstairs in his room and he was woken by some chanting. And he got out of bed and he looked through the floorboards because he could see light coming up from the living room below, and he saw the 2 sisters, the milliners, were dressed as if ready to go on a trip. And he heard them chanting and he heard what they were chanting, and all of a sudden there was a blinding flash of light and they disappeared. So the Scotsman repeated the chant, and there was a blinding flash of light, and he appeared on his own in a cellar in London. And he was obviously very, very frightened. He didn't know what had gone off. And then before too long, the sisters came back. And obviously they were very shocked to find him there. And they got a bunch of silks and satins and cloths and things with them. And they saw the Scotsman there, who they weren't expecting. So they said, "Oh dear, look what's happened to you here, have a glass of wine." So they gave him a glass of wine. He fell unconscious because obviously the wine was tampered with, and he woke up and the sisters had gone.
I think what I find interesting about this story is kind of the reality of it. Now, Simon told me there is evidence that these two sisters were hanged, but he's not found any evidence of a trial. Now, the mystical element of the story, the Scotsman magically appearing in London, that seems a bit far-fetched. However, what the story in general highlights is just the truth of, the witch trials and how afraid the country were of witches. And of course, there is the feminist angle to it too, as well. Here we have two sisters who live alone. They were probably spinsters, maybe unmarried, possibly widowed. And of course, they would be easy targets for a patriarchal witch hunt. Now, the point I'm making here, and Simon kind of alludes to this in the episode as well, is that whilst folklore stories aren't always real, they still tell us so much about what life was like for people in the past, because it reflects their hopes, their dreams, but also, and kind of sometimes more importantly, their fears, and the fears of the people and the fears of what they'd been told. And I just think it's very interesting. And part of the reason why I started this podcast is because, yes, I do love ghost stories, and folklore stories are just wonderful stories to tell and to hear. But it's also a great way to preserve the past, and specifically the past for everyday people, what life was like culturally for everyday people, because obviously in the history books you only really hear about the big stuff, the battles, the kings and the queens and the politicians and the lords and the ladies. But folklore and ghost stories as well, although often they are tragic, tell us so much about the past and the cultural past, which I just think is so important to preserve. Now, anyway, that aside, as always, these are just a couple of stories from honestly a really great episode. I know it's slightly different, slightly less eerie, though there's some really great tales. But like I said, I think it's nice to hear some folk stories as well. Now, you'll see if you already have, when you watched the episode, that I've did images just of the maps, because Simon and I didn't drive around Derbyshire, so I didn't actually visit these places. But I really wanted to try and show you the drive that Simon suggests. So if you go back, you can kind of see the route, the main roads that you can get from the different places. But I will also, I didn't do it in the episode, so I apologize. So I will do it in this one in the show notes below. I will write down the places, because Hathersage is spelled differently to how I thought it was. So I will write down the list of the places that we go to. So if you wanted to take your own drive through the Derbyshire countryside, you absolutely can. However, I will say, watch out for werewolves, witches, and giants, because although we're partly sure that these folk tales are just myths, who knows? Anyway, next week will be the penultimate episode for this season, and we're back into the more darker tales, histories. We're up in Lancashire, where we'll be hearing about the Pendle Witch Trial and the Pendle Witches. So make sure you subscribe below so you don't miss it.